Hey guys, it's me, Kari, and I'm going to read a little more of Dicey's song because right now my life is feeling pretty much like a dumpster fire and I don't want to think about it for a little bit. So here we go. James returned late Saturday with reports of what a good time he had had and how they had wanted him to come back, and they said soon. After supper, he settled down to read through a huge pile of books he had taken out of the library. They had lit a fire again, as they did most evenings now. Graham had gone up to the attic and brought down piles of warm socks, half a dozen pairs of work boots, and a pair of red rubber boots for Maybeth. There were also a couple rough, heavy sweaters for the boys. Dicey decided she would be glad to wear one of the old boys' sweaters on cold mornings, so Graham was knitting Maybeth's yellow sweater first. When Graham entered the living room with the armload of clothes, James lifted his head from the book and exchanged a glance with Dicey. She knew he was thinking about what else was up there in the attic. After the little kids had been put to bed, James insisted that Dicey confer with him. What he really meant was that she should listen to him, but that was okay with Dicey. He talked and talked about the different ways of teaching and the theories behind them. He used words she'd never heard before: dyslexia, dysgraphia, remediation, word recognition, effective learning, affective learning. Dicey didn't bother to ask him what everything meant. She just listened and nodded her head whenever he seemed to want her to. Finally, he told her, "There's a lot I can't understand yet. People have such different theories about education, and they've studied them." Dicey nodded. "And I haven't had very much experience myself. I never paid too much attention to what other people were doing in class, you know?" Dicey nodded again. Now she really was listening, however, because she wondered what James was leading up to. It wasn't like him to talk about what he didn't understand. He preferred to talk about what he knew. "But here's what I think. Graham, are you listening? If you think I'm wrong, I want you to tell me, because I just don't know enough. But I think for years and years they taught using the phonic method. Remember, Dicey, where you learn what letters and phonemes and blends say and you sound out words?" Dicey didn't remember, but that didn't matter. "My guess is that if they've used it for years, and it's the way we learned, and Massachusetts has one of the oldest public school systems in the country, and it's a good one too, that that's the one I want to use with Maybeth. What do you think? Because if it wasn't good, it wouldn't have lasted so long." Graham answered, It sounds reasoning, but you haven't read all those books, have you?" "No, how could I? Some I just looked over to see what the chapters were about." "But if it's the way Maybeth was taught in Provincetown," Dicey said. Then she stopped, noticing that she didn't even think to say "back home." James waited, so she went on. "Maybe it doesn't work for Maybeth." James' face was serious, and it was almost as if he was looking inside of his own head for the words he was going to speak, even though his eyes rested on Dicey. "Yeah, but listen. There's what they call the emotional overlay when someone has reading problems, like, I don't know, maybe layers of paint, and you have to scrape it off before you can get to the real problem. Like a kid who always gets in trouble in class, so he's always being punished and he never gets his work done. That way he avoids looking stupid, because he'd rather be bad than stupid. And Maybeth is better here. We all know that, don't you, Graham? She's not nearly so scared of things, of people. It's not so complicated for her here. We all know that. Without Mama to worry about and what people say. My theory is that that stuff interfered with her before, and it won't interfere now. What do you think?" "You could be right," Graham said. "What are you going to do next?" Dicey asked James. "Tomorrow I'll study this book on the phonics method, and then we'll start." "Is that enough time?" Graham asked. "Sure, and if I'm wrong, I know what method to try next. It's interesting, you know," James told them, his eyes bright. "I had no idea it was so interesting. It's made me curious about what Maybeth thinks. I mean, I don't think she's got a reading disorder. It's just slowness. But I wonder." His voice drifted off. Dicey looked at Graham and grinned. Graham smiled back and reversed her needles to begin another row. Dicey hung around quietly in the background during Maybeth's first lesson with James. She had her own books open in front of her, and she was sort of doing assignments, but mostly she listened to James and Maybeth working. The two heads bent together over a pad of paper, on which James wrote letters. Then he asked Maybeth what the letters said. Maybeth understood this, and Dicey thought she did pretty well at it. James's brown hair looked darker next to Maybeth's yellow curls, and her hair seemed to shine brighter next to his dark head. Dicey listened hard, not to hear precisely what they were saying, but to hear what the two speakers were like. If she was going to hold on, then she wanted to have a clear idea of who she was holding on to, so she could get a good grip. Besides, she admitted to herself, if she could learn how James did it, then she could help him out if he needed it, if it worked for Maybeth. And I have to pause because my husband is back unexpectedly from dealing with something, so fingers crossed. Okay, guys, I'm back. I'll read a little bit more, but this is going to be a quickie because my husband and I are dealing with some possibly catastrophic car trouble. We only own one car, and it's 23 years old, so if something catastrophic happens, I will have a literal meltdown because we will be completely screwed. But I'm praying to all in the universe that is good and wise that it'll be okay and not too astronomically expensive and that we can salvage our Cartman because we really can't afford not to. So anyway, a little bit more. Despite Dicey's firm intentions to concentrate on her family and on Graham too, and she didn't know how Graham would feel if she knew Dicey was thinking that, during the third week in November, the outside world seemed determined to get her attention. First it was the weather, which turned chilly, then cold. The sky hung gray and flat day after day. This muted all the colors except for the bare branches of the trees. Sorry guys, I lost my place, so I may be backtracking a little bit. First it was the weather, which turned chilly, then cold. The sky hung gray and flat day after day. This muted all the colors except for the bare branches of the trees, which turned deep black against the sky. When the wind was from the west, off the bay, it carried a dampness in it that penetrated through Dicey's clothing and wound around her bones. She couldn't work on the boat in that weather, not without the danger of chilblains. What are chilblains? Dicey had asked Graham. Graham had smiled. You know, I don't know. All my life I've heard about them and tried not to get them because they sound so awful. Chilblains, she repeated, listening to the sound of it, as if the little veins in your nose freeze individually. We'll ask James, Graham concluded, looking back to her knitting. She was halfway up the back of Maybeth's yellow sweater. She had already finished the front. And then Dicey got her report card. The school made a real ceremony of report cards. At the end of the school day, everybody went to his homeroom. When your name was called out, you went up to the front of the room. The homeroom teacher studied your grades, and then he would talk to you about your schoolwork. These conversations were kept to a low tone. Everybody in the front row pretended they couldn't hear and weren't listening. There were 40 kids in the homeroom, so it took a while for Dicey's name to come up. Dicey Tillerman, he called. Dicey went to stand next to the big desk. She tried to see the card, but he held it so she couldn't. He had his attendance book out in front of him and was making checks by each student's name after the report card was given out. He asked his questions without looking at her. She stared at his ear to answer. This is your first year here? Yes. Where did you go to school before? In Massachusetts. Huh. How do you like home ec? Dicey shrugged. He waited, so she put the shrugs into words. I don't know. You've got a good attendance record, he said, concluding their conversation. He uncapped his pen and marked down 2 zeros on the upper corner where there were places for absences and tardiness. Then he checked off her name in his attendance book. Finally, he gave her her report card. Dicey didn't even look down until she had sat down. She scanned down the grades. Home ec, F. That letter F jumped out at her eyes. What? Dicey wasn't any brain like James, but she did all right in school. Anger warmed her blood. What right did Miss Eversley have flunking her? She'd gone to all the classes, done everything she was told. She'd done everything badly, she knew that. And she had done everything with a minimum of effort and attention. But she had done it, and she hadn't ever made any trouble in class, unless you counted the time they all laughed, and that wasn't her fault. Dicey bit at her lower lip. She went back up the list of grades and saw a C+ by English. Now wait a minute, she thought. She'd been getting B's and A's in English. This one had to be a mistake. Mr. Chappelle must have copied someone else's grade down instead of hers. She wondered how she could get it corrected. She decided the best thing was to wait until the essays were handed back at the beginning of next week. Then she would ask Mr. Chappelle. She could ask him right away, she supposed, but the class had been pestering him so much about how long it took to get the essays back that Dicey was starting to feel sorry for him. She was as impatient as everyone else, but it didn't do any good nagging and complaining at him. He'd promised to get them back on Monday, and he'd apologized for taking so long, and he'd made excuses. Dicey felt, well, she'd believe it when she actually had her paper in her hand again. She wasn't at all sure he'd kept his promise, but she hoped he would. And then she'd ask him about her grade. She bet he would be surprised that he'd given her a C+. She was about the smartest kid in class, certainly one of the smartest. But that F in home ec was going to get her in trouble. When the bell rang, Dicey hurried out to see if Jeff was there. Hey, Jeff, she greeted him. Hi, Dicey. Think we'll ever see the sun again? How long has it been? 8 days? Did you ever hear a song called Dark as the Dungeon? Dicey shook her head impatiently. What happens if you flunk your minor? She demanded. Did you do that? He asked. His face was only curious, with maybe a little surprise, she decided. His eyes weren't smiling at all. Yeah, she said. Don't worry, nobody cares about minors much anyway. And until you're in high school, it doesn't matter about credits for graduation. Pass English and they pretty much have to pass you. You're passing English. Dicey didn't even answer that. She just gave him a look that said, "Of course I'm passing it. What a stupid question." Then he did smile at her. He asked her if she wanted to hear the song Dark as the Dungeon, and she said no, thank you. She couldn't. She had to get going. She waited until after supper to show Graham her report card. Graham had to sign it. There was a place on the back, a row of dotted lines, and underneath the words parent or guardian. Graham put her knitting needle aside and looked at the front of the card. Then she turned it over and signed it with the pen Dicey had ready for her. Then she turned it over and looked at the front again. Mama never even looked at the front, Dicey remembered. Mama, those last couple of years. She would take the report cards one at a time and sign her name carefully 4 times. She had to be careful because the boards on their old table were coming unglued and might make ridges in your writing, and it might look like you didn't even know how to write your name. Mama's long hair fell forward when she bent her head down. Mama said her hair started out the color of Sammy's and Maybeth's, but it got darker as she got older. Mama's hair rippled down her back like sunlight, like music, like the music Maybeth was playing then on the piano. Well, Graham said. Well, it doesn't matter about home ec, Dicey assured her. That's just a minor. It's okay to flunk it. It is? Graham wondered. Why are you failing? Dicey thought about that. I don't like the class. I know you wanted mechanical drawing, I remember. And I'm not trying, but I go to every class and do everything she says. Sort of. Then she told Graham about her apron, about how she got around the rules. She even told Graham about how the rest of the class had laughed, because once she was started, that was part of the story. Dicey found she didn't mind telling Graham, and when Graham laughed too, she joined in. You aren't making trouble in class? Nope, I keep quiet. You're sure it's not going to? I don't know, they talk about your school records. I asked someone, Dicey said. Graham looked at her for a long minute, then accepted it. The rest, except for English, are all very good, all A's. Dicey looked down. She hadn't noticed those, not really. The English is a mistake, she said to Graham. Are you sure? Dicey was sure. You're not just fooling yourself? Dicey shook her head. I'm going to ask him about it on Monday, you'll see. I believe you, Graham said, and she did. Dicey could tell. Dicey liked that Graham really believed her, because she knew her, made her Dicey's heart swell up and warm. Dicey felt like putting her arms around Graham and hugging her hard, but she didn't, of course. Graham wasn't the kind of person who wanted to be hugged. So Dicey just smiled and said thanks. She drifted over to the piano and sat down beside Maybeth on the bench. For a while, she watched Maybeth's fingers pushing down the keys, the white keys and the black ones. She noticed for the first time what pretty delicate hands Maybeth had, and the way her fingernails shone rosily. Then Dicey looked at the page of the music. It was something called a minuet by someone called Bach. How would you pronounce that, Dicey wondered idly, listening, remembering the phonemes that James had talked about with Maybeth. Bach? Bach? Bash? She'd asked James if he knew. There weren't that many notes on the page of music. It didn't look too hard, but the music Maybeth made from it sounded too perfect for the score to be so simple as it seemed. The notes flowed out from under her fingers. The rhythm was steady, but the melody danced round as if it was doing whatever it wanted, whenever it felt like it. It sounded like a dance, and when Maybeth finished, before she could turn to something else, Dicey asked her, what does it mean? Mean? I don't know. Then how do you decide what to play loud or fast or smooth together? Maybeth looked at her with round eyes. It's just the way it sounds, when it sounds right. Play it again? Maybeth did. Dicey listened, and she still couldn't understand how Maybeth knew what it was supposed to sound like altogether. I really like hearing you play, she told Maybeth. Maybeth smiled and her eyes shone at Dicey. She didn't say anything. Then while Dicey was washing down the floor at work on Wednesday, and Millie was leaning over the counter telling her about chickens and what the best breeds were, what were each breed's advantages and disadvantages, Jeff came in. Dicey saw him before he saw her. He'd gone over to the Sugars and was looking at the boxes and bags. He carried his guitar slung over his back like a minstrel out of Robin Hood. He wore a down vest and his cheeks shone pink. Millie went to help him, and he looked up. Then he saw Dicey. Hey, Dicey, he said, surprised. Hey, Jeff. She was careful not to sound surprised. She pushed the mop down into the bucket of warm water and sloshed them down onto the floor. She swirled the water with the mop before getting down to the real scrubbing. He came to stand in front of her. She ignored him. You work here? He asked. Yeah. Every day? Pretty near. She still hadn't looked at him. I didn't know that, he said. That was nothing Dicey needed to answer. I've only been in here a couple times in the last year, he said, to pick up odds and ends. He waited. Dicey mocked. He moved his booted feet away from where she wanted to clean. Dicey mopped. Dicey? She didn't look up. See you. She nodded. She heard him pay for the box of sugar, heard the door close, heard Millie go back to her position behind the meat counter. She could feel Millie staring at her. Finally, her employer spoke. He your fellow? Dicey snorted. Just someone I met at school. He's kind of cute, Millie said. Does he play that guitar? No, Dicey thought of saying. He just carries it around. But instead, because it was Millie, she answered politely. Yes. He looks so young, Millie said absently. And so do you. But I'm used to you, I guess. I remember, her voice drifted on behind Dicey's head, when we were young. Ab and Herbie, John Tillerman. I can't remember that young, though. Me that young, though. Isn't that a funny thing? You remember, Graham? What was she like? Dicey said. She stopped working and was looking at Millie's face. Millie was staring somewhere into the front of the store. I guess we called her Pert, she said, with a smile moving her thick features. She had quite a tongue, did Ab, and she'd as soon bite your head off as smile at you. She kept things hopping wherever she was. Some people didn't, but I liked her. I guess she used to make us laugh sometimes, the things she'd say, the things she'd do. Then after she married John, it wasn't the same. Well, she shook her face to bring her attention back. I guess it never is. I guess she was kept busy on the farm, and her children, and things the way John wanted them. But I can remember. Dicey stayed still, not to interrupt, not to distract Millie. Once, years ago, I saw Ab downtown with her 3 children, the little girl about as pretty as your sister. They were having a race, running down the sidewalk, all 4 of them running as fast as they could. Oh, they were having a good time. Millie stopped talking and didn't recommence, although Dicey waited a good while. Dicey tried to figure out a question to get her reminiscing again. Then Millie started talking again as if she had been thinking her own thoughts in the silence. I never saw her much all those years. John mostly did the shopping. I guess she always kept pretty busy. And then she got queer. They always have shopped in here, the Tillermans, Millie said proudly. Dicey got back to her work, trying to see the picture Millie had been looking at. Grandma, young woman like Mama, and her 3 children. Mama and Bullet and John, all 3 of them in a race. Bullet would have been last because he was smallest, unless Mama hung back to let him beat her. That was the kind of thing Dicey thought Mama would have done. She wished she could ask Graham if that was the way it had happened. The trouble with holding on was Dicey only had 2 hands. She felt like she was always off balance, trying to hold on to everyone. What happened next to put Dicey off her stride was that Millie remembered a message from Graham. The message told Dicey to wait at work until Sammy showed up. All right, we're going to stop there, guys. Thank you so much for listening, and I will be back soon with more of the book and more stuff.